Hello students, welcome to the chapter of the axial skeleton where we're pretty much again going to explore part of the skeletal system. Now the whole skeletal system consists of 206 bones, but the good news is that you don't have to memorize all these bones. We're just going to go over the main important bones and name the important features of all these bones. The whole skeletal system, we like to divide it in two portions. One is the axial skeleton, which we're going to talk about in this lecture. And the second portion is the appendicular skeleton. And the definition already tells you what these two portions refer to. The axial skeleton forms the axis of the body, okay? And this one that is highlighted in orange. While the appendicular skeleton essentially is formed by the limbs, the upper limb and the lower limb, so the arms and the legs, but also by the portions of the skeletal system that connect those limbs to the axial skeleton that I'm highlighting right now. So the axial skeleton is again forms the axis of the body and is composed of three portions by itself: the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. Okay, and we're gonna look at all these components in quite detail. The appendicular skeleton is formed by the upper limb, the lower limb, and structures that connect those to the axial skeleton, which are respectively the pectoral girdle, which is formed by basically the clavicle and the scapula, okay, shown here, and the pelvic girdle, which basically consists of the two pelvic bones and the sacrum. Okay, collectively they are known as pelvis. We're going to look at this again in detail. The axial skeleton itself consists of about 80 bones and is divided in three major parts or regions known as skull, vertebral column, and thoracic cage. In this presentation, we're going to talk about the skull, and then in a second presentation, we're going to talk about these other two, the vertebral column and the thoracic cage. Of course, the axial skeleton forms the axis of the body and supports, therefore, pretty much most of the body, supports head, neck, and trunk, but also protects the brain and all the internal organs that are pretty much protected by the thoracic cage. So very important functions. Oops. The first region we're going to look at is the skull. The skull itself is divided into two other regions, subregions, or set of bones. So we have the set that forms the cranium, okay? So we're going to look at the cranial bones, and then we have the facial bones. The cranial bones are these ones, and all together form a cage that encloses the brain and form the cranial cavity. And also provide attachment for head and neck muscles. The facial bones form the framework of face and contain cavities for many cavities, and then many foramens as well. In a minute here, we're going to talk about how to name all these openings that we can recognize on bones of the skull and facial bones as well. Anyways, facial bones contain cavities for special sense organs for sight, taste, and smell, provide openings for air and food passage as well, so this is very important. They secure teeth, as we will see. Also anchor facial muscles used for facial expressions. As you know, most skull bones are flat and they're firmly locked together in this kind of joints that you should know. The name of them is sutures. Of course, we have looked at them already, and you should know what kind of joints they are. Remember, these are immobile. Okay, how do we call this immobile type of joints? Synarthrosis. Okay. And generally, we can recognize general features in the skull. If we take a superior view of the cranium and we cut it in a cross section, we can appreciate depressions. 3 sets of depressions are present in pairs on each side, which are known as anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and posterior cranial fossa. This is the posterior portion of course, the body, and this is the anterior, and that's why they're named that way. Each of these fossa accommodates a portion of the body, a portion of the brain, I'm sorry. And for instance, if we look at the posterior one here in a mid-sagittal section, we can appreciate how, and here the brain is represented, the cerebellum is accommodated in this depression in the posterior cranial fossa. All right, so these are general aspects. We can also recognize cavities in the skull. Here is a frontal section, for instance, the first one that is very obvious is the cranial cavity. We have already talked about this cavity when we talked about body cavities, and this is part of it is one region of the dorsal body cavities. We also can recognize the oral cavity, which is open to the outside. The orbital cavities here, we're not talking about specific cavities. We're not organizing them based on if they're close to the external world or open to external world. We're just recognizing the cavities that we can see when we apply this kind of plane, coronal sectional plane to the skull. So orbital cavities, and then here they're not visible, but there are the middle ear cavities, and then of course the nasal cavity. Okay, so these are cavities of the cranium. Now, other cavities that we recognize, they're smaller, are the paranasal sinuses, which are special cavities because they contain air-filled spaces which are lined with a mucosa, and the function of these sinuses, which are represented here, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 types. The function of these sinuses is to warm and humidify air as it comes through the nose. Also, because they're cavities, they definitely help lighten the skull, and they also enhance the resonance of voice. They're cavities that are formed just because of the shape of several bones that come together and actually determine the formation of these cavities. The bones that form these, that are involved in the formation of these paranasal sinuses are the frontal, the sphenoid, the ethmoid, and the paired of maxillary bones, as we will see. And so we recognize these 5 types. These are the frontal here, then there are the ethmoidal over here, then there is the here the maxillary as well, okay, and sphenoidal as well over here. Okay, and the ethmoidal actually are a few of them. Okay, so these again, these are important to kind of know of. Maxillary as well. Okay, so when we look at skull geography, we can rotate the skull, of course, and take different views. This is an inferior view of the skull. We can recognize many openings. Okay, look at these openings here. Some are oval shaped, some are round shapes. Some others look more as a longer shape. And so totally we can actually count 85 and name 85 openings on the skull. And these openings, they're all majorly for the passage of nerves and blood vessels. Of course, you can't expect that blood vessels or nerves, they won't have a channel and openings dedicated to them, because otherwise they will be obviously smashed by the hard bone tissue. All right, so totally we recognize 85, but you don't have to remember all 85. I'm going to name the more important ones as we scroll through all the bones. And generally speaking, we name them in different ways. There are the foramina and the fissures, which are really openings. They're both openings, but the foramina are more typically round shaped, and the singular is foramen. For instance, the biggest one here that we can recognize is the foramen magnum, okay, through which the brain stem passes. And the fissures tends to be more narrow slit-like openings, but they're just both openings. Canal refers to really a channel, okay? And so it's typically you can name a foramen with the same name as the canal. The foramen is the opening of that channel, of that canal. All right, so the cranium, the first part of the skull that we're going to look at, is composed of 8 bones, and these are the frontal, the parietal, which are 2 bones actually, left and right. Occipital bone is 1 bone. Temporal bones are 2 bones, left and right, the sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone, and they're all represented here. So this is the frontal bone. Is very occupies a very large surface. These are the parietal bones, okay, left and right. And then occipital bone, you cannot see it from an anterior view. We're going to see it from a posterior view just in a minute. Then you have the temporal bones. You can see some of surface of temporal bones here in this frontal view. Sphenoid bone, which actually you can see some of it here from this view, but there is much more to it. We're going to see how this sphenoid bone has a very interesting shape. And then the ethmoid bone, which also you see just a portion of it here, okay, ethmoid bone. This was the anterior view. This is a posterior view where you can appreciate now the occipital bone here. It's also pretty large. And one thing that is important here is to kind of course have a good visualization of all the bones and be able, of course, to recognize them and name them, but also what are the point of connections between the various bones. And of course, the bones of the skull, they come together in these joints, particular joints known as sutures. We're going to look at the sutures here in a minute, and we have to remember the names of these sutures. Other interesting bones that we're going to talk about are the sutural bones. These very small bones that not everybody has, and the function of these bones is unknown. It's probably one of those bones that used to have probably a function, but they have lost their function, and so in some individuals they may not even form. Okay, this is an external view of the right side of the skull, and again, just to appreciate the point of connections of all the bones, how they come together. And again, you have to try to kind of memorize. See here, for instance, is portion of the sphenoid bone and how it articulates between here the frontal bone here and the temporal bone, for instance, and also connects to the parietal bone. So you have to, and of course, when we talk about the facial bones, also with the zygomatic bone, which is pretty prominent bone here that connects with many of the cranial bones as well. So again, this is a general geography. We're going to take a look at single bones here in a minute. For instance, one important feature of the geography of the skull is this region here, this arch. You see how it's an arch? It's known as the zygomatic arch, and is formed by the fusion of processes which are elongated features of the temporal bone and the zygomatic bone. And generally speaking, when we have these, so if the temporal bone has a process, okay, sorry, this didn't come out really well. I'm gonna try to make it again. If it has a process, okay, so it kind of like a process is like my arm is a process of my body, is an elongated feature that sticks out, okay, let's say. And this process articulates with another bone, or maybe the process of another bone. That process will take the name of the bone with which it articulates. So if this is the temporal bone, and this process articulates with the zygomatic bone, this process will be the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, okay? So it's the zygomatic process of the temporal bone because, again, it will articulate with the zygomatic bone. And conversely, if the zygomatic bone has a process here that articulates with the temporal bone, therefore that process is going to be called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, okay? So this is what you have to go by as a principle. You don't have to memorize names too much here. If you understand and you have clear in mind the geography of the skull in general and where all the bones are located, I advise you to try to make sketches, okay? Then, if I ask you to name, or if I ask you a name of a specific process, you can almost take an educated guess. Knowing the names of the bones and the fact that this is named process, then you can just name them. You don't have to really remember them, okay? Okay, so now we're gonna look at the sutures, the specific sutures that we have to know, okay? They're all named here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is the parietal bone, and of course this is the frontal bone. So the coronal suture is located, it's the suture, the joint, and you should know what kind of joint this is, okay? I'm not gonna repeat it again. The suture between the parietal bone and the frontal bone, okay? This is the occipital bone, of course. The sagittal suture is the suture between the right and left parietal bone, okay? And it's called sagittal because right in the middle, you can put a sagittal plane through it, right? And so that's why it's called sagittal. Whereas here is like more coronal, right? Then there is the lambdoid structure, suture, sorry, that looks like a lambda, a Greek lambda, and that's why it's called lambdoid. And this is in between the parietal bones and the occipital bone. The last one is going to be your squamous suture, which is between the parietal bone and the temporal bones, okay? So it's pretty much this one. All right, so these sutures, name of these sutures and the location has to be known, okay? And of course, when you have a skull in front of you, it's easier in a way to remember, and I'll try to give you mostly pictures, question with pictures in the test, so that you can kind of, visualize it better. But I cannot give you all pictures because otherwise it's going to be too heavy for the program to support the test. All right, the frontal bone is the first one that we're going to look at. Is this bone that occupies a large area actually of the cranium and located really in the frontal portion of an anterior portion of the cranium. Is a shell-shaped bone, we can recognize a vertical part that is known as squamous region, okay, or also known as the forehead here. The inferior portion, which is this one here, ends with the supraorbital margins. Why supraorbital margins? Because these are margins, part of that are superior part of the orbital cavity. They actually contribute to the formation of the orbital cavity. And this forms also the superior wall of the orbits, of course. And most of the anterior cranial fossa is pretty much formed by this bone, of course, as we saw before. The supraorbital foramen here is a hole, right, over here, that allows the supraorbital artery and nerve to pass to the forehead. Okay, so this, again, all these foramens that we're going to talk about, they're all important for passage of nerves, and sometimes just nerves, sometimes both nerves and vessels, blood vessels. The glabella is this little depression here. It's kind of a landmark, more than having a function. It doesn't really have a function, but it the frontal sinuses are located just lateral to it, but the depression itself does not really have a known function. It's more of a preferment point, especially for surgeons in the medical field. All right, so the temporal bones, okay, are paired bones that make up the inferior lateral aspect of the skull and also part of the cranial base. And the shape is very recognizable and have this very prominent zygomatic process. We just talked about it. Remember the arch that we talked about is partially formed by this process. Zygomatic process because it connects to the zygomatic bone. And we can recognize three portions in these three major regions in this bone. One is the squamous part that actually contains the zygomatic process to form the zygomatic arch. Then we have the tympanic part, which is this one, which surrounds the external acoustic meatus. Meatus is an opening as well. And then we have the petrous part. Petra means rock. So it looks a little rocky here, right, in this area, and that's why it's the petrous part. Is a pyramid-shaped portion that houses the middle and internal ear cavities. All right, so the next one we're going to talk about is the occipital bone. This is also known as C0 because it joins the skull to the first cervical vertebra, which is known as C1. So it forms the atlanto-occipital joint, so-called, okay? And so that's why it's known as C0 as well. Is a trapezoid type of bone, its shape, and this is an external view, while this is an internal view that will show you the fossas. For instance, this is the cerebellar fossa, okay, that accommodates the cerebellum. And you can appreciate, of course, the foramen magnum, which is possible to miss, right? This huge foramen that permits the communication from the cranial cavity to the vertebral canal, of course. Some features, an important feature of the occipital bone are the external occipital protuberance, which is right here, right superior to the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is here, sorry. This one, so superior to the foramen magnum. Then we could recognize the external occipital crest, which is a ridge that is site of attachment of the ligamentum nuchae, which is a ligament. So all these ridges that you see always on bones are always ridges for attachment of muscles, and so for ligaments. Then we have the superior and inferior nuchal line, which are again the site of attachment of neck and back muscles. So this is it for the occipital bone. Now we're going to look at the sphenoid bone, which again you can't miss it because it has this butterfly or bat shape, okay? It's a very symmetrical bone, and in this you can only see a part of this bone when you look at an intact skull. So you would have to either take it out to look at it, like here, or try to imagine to zoom in to make the other bones that are covering it transparent in order to see it. So we can recognize, first of all, this bone is a key bone because it articulates for all other cranial bones pretty much, okay? So, and see how it's really there, kind of like in between all the bones. And we can recognize three major regions here. First of all, there is the body, which is this one in blue. And then we have the greater wings in red and the lesser wings in green. and pterygoid process in yellow. Okay, this is just for the description. We also recognize many foramens and features and canals in this bone. The optical canals here, they allow the passage of optic nerves. Then we have this superior orbital fissure. Here is fissure because it's not called foramen, but fissure because it's elongated. And optic canal here, many times you will see that you will call it foramen. Okay, so this is the canal. It is the foramen, and it opens up into the canal. So you can in this picture it's just calling it canal, but you could have another picture where it calls it foramen because it's actually indicated the opening of that canal. Then there are the foramen rotundum and the foramen ovale. Rotundum means more like round-shaped, ovale is oval-shaped. So again, these are all passages for cranial nerves. And then the foramen spinosum is actually opening specifically for arteries. There are sinuses that are found in the body of the sphenoid bones, okay, and the sphenoid bone, and we're gonna actually look at these sinuses later, okay, in this presentation. One other feature that I want you to remember of this bone is this prominence known as sella turcica, okay, which has these depressions, very dramatic depression in it, is known as hypophyseal fossa, and this accommodates the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland fits perfectly into this depression, and pituitary gland, as we'll see, is the mother of all your glands. It receives signaling directly from the brain, so it's an amazing organ, very, very important to regulate all hormones, basically, hormonal production in your body. And so, again, in a sagittal, mid-sagittal section, we can appreciate it, okay, over here. This is a superior view that I was showing you here in this one, okay. You can see the sella turcica here as well, okay, but you can appreciate really how the shape of this depression accommodates the pituitary gland, okay, in the mid-sagittal section. And that's pretty much all I'm telling you about this bone. Remember, it pretty much articulates with all other cranial bones. The next bone we're going to talk about is the ethmoid bone, which is the deepest skull bone, and it's a very, very thin as paper bone. The superior part over here is formed by paired cribiform plates, shown here. Cribiform because they have many holes in them, the perforations, and through these perforations run many divisions of the olfactory or first cranial nerve, okay. Then we have this prominence here, this known as crista galli. Remember the crest of a roster, okay, crista. So this is a triangular process that is the point of attachment of an important membrane of the brain, which is the dura mater. We're going to talk about it when we talk about a nerve system. Then there is the perpendicular plate here. This one forms part of the nasal septum, okay, and is flanked by these lateral masses that contain sinuses. These are called ethmoidal air cells, okay. And then there are the orbital plates here that contribute to the medial wall of orbits. I do have, of course, I'm going to present to you a slide where you're going to see all the bones that contribute to the formation of the orbits. Okay, we're going to talk about that specifically. And two other features here are the superior nasal conchae and the middle nasal conchae. These are just portions of this bone, whereas there is another one. There is another conchae, as we'll see, inferior, that is considered a bone on its own. We're going to talk about it. All right, so the sutural bones, as I told you, they're bones that of unknown function. They're very tiny, not present in every individual. All right, so now we're going to take a look at the facial bones, okay? Don't get scared. These are 14 bones, but there aren't 14 bones to be remembered because most of them come in pair, okay? Only two of them are single bones. The two that are single bones are the mandible over here and the vomer, okay? This little blue bone over here. The rest of them all come in pair, starting from the maxillary bones, okay, over here in yellow, the zygomatic bones in green over here, the lacrimal bones, which are these ones highlighted in azure or light blue, and lastly the palatine bones, which are these two small bones over here. Okay, so altogether we have 14, but we only have to remember about 8 bones here. So we're going to start with the mandible, which is the largest and strongest bone of the face. It's a U-shaped kind of bone made up of a body and 2 rami. So basically this one is the body, okay? The ramus in Latin it means branch. So these are 2 branches. So the rami are the branches and this one is the body, okay? And I don't care for you to remember the angle. This is the mandibular angle, which is in between the body and the ramus. What's important here is to appreciate here the condylar process here, okay, which is posterior to the coronoid and process, and coronoid process is this one. There are 2, of course. The condylar process forms part of the temporomandibular joint, which is a synovial joint, okay? Here. This is the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone, which articulates with a condylar process, and this forms a joint, a synovial type of joint, okay? Which is pretty movable, right? This is the movable part of really of the entire skull. So that's very important to remember, okay? This one that I just pointed out. The mental foramen is located over here, and it's again for the passage of nerves and blood vessels as well, okay? That's the most prominent. Then there is also the mandibular foramen, which also again for the mandibular is mostly for the nerve passage. The coronoid process is not meant for articulation, but is meant for specifically for insertion of the large temporalis muscle that we're going to look at when time comes. Okay. All right, so mandible is very movable thanks to this condylar process that articulates with the temporal bone, okay, and in a synovial type of joint. All right, so the next bone that we're going to talk about is the maxillary bones or maxilla. These are majorly fused, okay, to form the upper jaw and also the central facial skeleton, okay, all over here, okay. And if there is a process that goes upward on this bone that connects to the frontal bone, what do we call it? We call it frontal process, okay. Here you can appreciate the infraorbital foramen. What is going to be this foramen for? Okay, it's called infraorbital because it's right below the orbit. Okay, this is going to be your zygomatic process because guess what? Guess which bone it connects to. Will it connect to the temporal bone or maybe to the zygomatic bone? Okay, over here. So it's zygomatic process. Then we have several processes. We have the palatine process, then we have the frontal process, and also the alveolar process. Okay, and these are all again processes to connect to these specific bones. The alveolar processes are all these processes in that pretty much point of attachments for teeth, okay, for the upper teeth. All right, so you have here several views of this bone, okay. So again, the location is important. The processes tell you which bones it articulates with, okay. And then you have another feature here that we didn't talk about actually is the anterior nasal spine. It just forms just below the nose, okay. Here it's another feature of this bone. The alveolar processes are they house pretty much the upper teeth, okay. And the maxillary sinuses flank the nasal cavity pretty much laterally, okay. And again, we're gonna look at them in another slide more specifically. But it's actually it's shown here, okay. So they flank the nasal cavity laterally, okay. All right, so here I want to show you some openings for nerves and blood vessels that are very important, okay, and they're pretty much formed or present in the facial bones. These are the inferior orbital fissure, okay, which is shown over here. It's very important to point out, okay, important, very important for several nerves and blood vessels. So we're gonna talk about this more in detail when we talk about nerve system. And then we have the infraorbital foramen here, okay, very important, and the incisive fossa over here, which is more depression there, okay, And again, these are openings for important nerves and blood vessels. Okay, so infraorbital foramen on the maxilla, located on the maxilla. These are important openings that I want to point out to be remembered and recognized here in the facial bones. Okay, now we're going to talk about the zygomatic bones, which form cheekbones and inferolateral margins of the orbits. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. Okay, zygomatic bone. Okay, start with this colored skulls and visualizing and naming all the bones. Okay, and then you can pretty much, if you understand all the positioning and how to name according to position, you already know these form, of course, cheekbones and inferolateral margins. Inferolateral margin of orbits, right? It makes a lot of sense. They articulate with zygomatic processes of temporal, frontal, and maxillary bones, because all the bones that will have processes that articulate with this bone will take the name of this bone. Okay. All right. So over here, zygomatic process of frontal bone. Okay. Over here, of the maxillary bone over here, and the temporal bone as well, as we have seen it already before. Okay, you cannot appreciate it very well in this picture, but we have already looked at this. Okay, at the very beginning of that arch, we looked at the arch that is formed. Here you can appreciate it better, what I'm talking about. Other important facial bones are the nasal bones and the lacrimal bones. Okay, these are smaller. So again, this is a frontal view here. So we're talking about the nasal bones, jugular bones over here. Okay, and this is a lateral view. Okay. These form the bridge of the nose and articulate with frontal, maxillary, and ethmoid bones as well. Okay, and more prominent here, more visible is see how the maxillary intercalates here. Okay, and of course the frontal over here. Okay, and the ethmoid bones. Cannot see that very well here, okay, but it does. You'll see here, you can see a little bit of the ethmoid bone, but internally it articulates with them as well. Then we have the lacrimal bones. Okay, the lacrimal bones are very small, and over here highlighted in green. Okay. These form the medial walls of the orbits. Again, we're going to look at the orbits specifically and all the bones that contribute to the formation of the orbits themselves. These lacrimal bones articulate with the frontal, maxillary, and ethmoid bone as well, just like the nasal bones. There is a lacrimal fossa that actually, over here, the lacrimal fossa houses the lacrimal sacs that allows passageways for tears to drain. Okay, that's where the tears come from. The other two bones we're going to look at are the palatine bones and the vomer, which is a single bone. Okay, and the palatine bones are actually L-shaped bones that in which we recognize two plates, basically. The perpendicular plate over here and the horizontal plate over here. Okay, you see the L shape. And the horizontal plate completes the posterior third part of the hard palate. You see the palate here? So this is the anterior and this is the posterior part, so you understand it completes with this green. I'm sorry, I'm actually over here maybe, okay? The third posterior part of the palate, of the hard palate, and the perpendicular plate form part of the posterior lateral walls of the nasal cavity. See over here, okay? And also small part, a very small part of the orbits as well. Okay, so the vomer is a plow-shaped bone and forms part of the nasal septum, okay? And it's over here, highlighted very well, okay? That's all I'm gonna tell you about the vomer, okay? All right, so I told you there is one bone, one of the conchi that is a bone on its own, okay? And this is the inferior nasal conchi, okay? It's over here, okay? While the other two conchi, the superior nasal conchi and the middle nasal conchi, are actually part of the ethmoid bone, considered part of the ethmoid bone, okay? Whereas the inferior nasal conchi, it's a bone on its own. And so paired bone that forms part of the lateral walls of the nasal cavity, okay? Inferior nasal conchi mid-sagittal view. Over here, this is a frontal view. And here you can appreciate over here, this bone, okay? And generally speaking, the conchi serve to increase the surface area of the nasal cavity and to pretty much to disrupt the flow of air because it enters in the nose, cause it to bounce along all the epithelium, and this disruption is important to, in order for the air itself to be cleaned up and also warmed up. So air is kind of like disrupted as it enters the nasal cavity, thanks to this all this conchi, and this is very important to clean up the air that comes into that is destined to the lungs, of course, and to warm it up as it comes into the body. All right, so now, and this was the last one that we talked about, we're going to look at special characteristic of the nasal cavity as well as the orbits, okay? We're going to understand which bones contribute to the several aspects of the nasal cavity. There are several bones to contribute that contribute to the nasal cavity. The roof of the nasal cavity is formed by the cribriform plates of the ethmoid bone. Remember that when we talked about ethmoid bone, we talked about the cribriform plates, okay? And so this is the roof, okay? The cribriform plate forms the roof of the nasal cavity. The lateral walls are formed by the superior and middle conchi of the ethmoid, the perpendicular plates of palatine, and the inferior nasal conchi as well, okay? And the spaces between the conchi are called meatuses, okay, or singular meatus. In reality, should be meatai, okay, but you will see this word pretty much on the book everywhere. And the floor is formed by the process of the palatine and the maxillary bone as well. Okay, the nasal septum, okay, is formed by the vomer, okay, over here, and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, as I already pointed out before, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. The anterior in the nasal septum can be divided in posterior and anterior. The anterior is formed by a septal cartilage. Okay, septal cartilage is just cartilage. Okay, as you know, touch your nose and you'll touch it. All right, so a special characteristic of the orbits, many bones contribute to the formation of orbits, which are the cavities that encase the eyes, of course, and lacrimal glands as well. So there are 7 bones totally that take part into the formation of these cavities, and these are the frontal, the sphenoid, the zygomatic, the maxilla, the palatine, the lacrimal, and the ethmoid, and they're all, of course, highlighted here. The frontal bone, okay, the sphenoid bone really in the back, okay, over here. This is sphenoid bone, and the zygomatic bone, of course, the sphenoid, the maxilla, okay, the ethmoid bone, a lacrimal bone, as you would imagine, and also a little bit of the palatine bone over here. Okay, so this is important. Okay, the contribution of all the bones that form the orbits. I want to talk about a minute about the developmental aspects of the skeleton. You all know that infant skull has more bones than adult skull, because skull bones such as mandible and frontal bones are unfused. They will fuse eventually, so they count as more bones. Another important thing is that the skull bones are connected by fontanelles. Okay, fontanelles are really openings, okay, that are anossified fibrous membranes, basically connective tissue. These are important because they ease birth and allow also the brain to grow, and eventually they will calcify and they close up. And you know that we all know that we don't have to touch them because it's kind of like soft, and you could, if you press on them too much, you could really damage the brain. So there are the anterior, the posterior, the mastoid, and sphenoidal fontanelles. Okay, this is the mastoid over here. Okay, and these are the anterior fontanelle and the posterior fontanelle. Okay, and this is the sphenoidal fontanelle over here. Okay, so this is important to know as well. The last bone I want to talk about is a bone that belongs nowhere. Is a bone on its own, is the hyoid bone. It's not a bone of the skull. I'm talking about it right now because again, belongs nowhere. So because we're now talking about the axial skeleton, and we're done with the skull, but we're going to talk about the vertebrae soon. It's kind of located right there in between. And so it's not, does not articulate with any other bone in the body. It's only anchored by ligaments. Okay, it's kind of like a interesting, very interesting bone. We recognize a body and horns here, right? Horns because there are no points of articulation with other bones. This bone acts as a movable base of tongue, and it's also site of attachment for muscles and of swallowing and speech. All right, so that's, and of course it lies, this is the position, it lies in anterior neck and inferior to mandible. All right, so I am done with this part. I will see you in part 2 of the axial.